There is a chance to stop them. A horrible weapon. Not even its creator can control it. You must destroy it.
We are talking Tower of Silence, which is also known as PALADIN. This one is directed by Erik Flynn Patton and tries to be Dungeons and Dragons, I would say, but it's less Dungeons and Dragons and more green screens and zombies. So this is a very low budget fantasy movie with high ambition, but maybe the ambition is a little bit too much for the budgetary restraints here. But let's discuss. So basically what we have here, we have a kind of a fantasy sort of style landscape, and we have our kind of a group of heroes who are trying to rescue a kind of sorceress from, you know, the bad guys, and we have these sort of this kind of like necromancer and this kind of like bad guy knight, and they're kind of like army of kind of zombie type creatures. And it's up to our sort of small group of heroes to go on essentially a quest, traverse the landscape, try and kind of rally the forces of good to defeat the kind of the bad guys in an epic clash in low budget CGI green screen fashion. So what can we talk about with this movie in the plus column? Well, like I've said, I feel this movie has absolutely bags of ambition. There's clearly a kind of a world here that the filmmakers want to produce. You know, very much in the style of kind of obviously Dungeons and Dragons, that sort of thing. The movie has a kind of an interesting look in regards to its heroes. They always look like kind of conquistadors, which I thought was an interesting choice. I have a feeling it's more what was on hand rather than a design choice, to be honest with you. But it nonetheless almost adds the kind of like a somewhat kind of like real world feel, because obviously they kind of like Spanish conquistadors, but obviously we're talking about necromancers, zombies and things like this, so obviously it's a fantasy movie, but you know, it's an interesting kind of mix here. The movie also tries to have a lot of different types of kind of characters within the movie. I quite like that our group of heroes don't get on particularly well. There's kind of some friction because one of them is very gun-ho, and the other two are kind of a bit more kind of reserved and don't really kind of want to try and avoid the fight. And they're kind of like more magic users, whilst we have our fighter who's a bit more kind of sort of bull-headed and kind of violent. So that I thought was a kind of a neat touch. But I've got to say, this movie was a struggle. It felt long. And this movie isn't particularly long. It's just probably just over an hour and a half. But man, it dragged. It dragged. Okay, so the real issue here is the budget, because it just cannot afford to do what the filmmakers want it to do. I mean, it just, everything here looks so cheap. I mean, in modern kind of fantasy films, and I'm a huge fantasy movie fan, you know, I love the kind of the fantasy movies of the 80s, and even the lower budget ones. You kind of like your Barbarian Queens, your Deathstalkers, and we have our kind of our modern wave of kind of fantasy films, and they can't help but having a more modern look to it. And this really is that a very kind of contemporary kind of look. You know, for the casting, for the kind of like the hair and that sort of stuff. You never really get the sense. This looks more like LARP players, if you know what I mean, than kind of an attempt to have a historical fantasy movie. The issue is quite obvious green screen, which kind of gives it obviously a very kind of fake feel and a cheap feel. Even kind of some of the kind of like the foreground props when they're meant to be having scenes when obviously there's grass in front, and you can see it's kind of like the fake plastic grass that you have on kind of like inside golf strips and things like that, AstroTurf, whatever it's called. But you know, things like this, it's just really kind of cheap looking. The dialogue is so cringeworthy, and I think the filmmakers here have missed a trick, and they should have maybe gone for more of a spoofy, because I think you can maybe get away with it a little bit more if the movie is a little bit more of a kind of a tongue-in-cheek affair. but they take it very seriously, and the dialogue is just so hammy, and the delivery from the actors here, saying this very kind of like stilted dialogue, is just cheesed. It's just, you know, it is 100% stilted in this movie. The performances, honestly, I mean, this makes Tommy Wiseau look like an Oscar winner. It really does. I mean, I don't want to be too personal in things like when I'm reviewing a film, but woof, you know, I get sent to the screener and it's just like, oh God, they're looking for me to, you know, saying good things about it, but I just can't do it with this one, I'm afraid. I think this movie is, I think sometimes that you can enjoy a movie, even a bad movie to a certain degree, but something like this, I feel is, I don't think it has a huge audience from anywhere, even kind of fans of kind of, you know, low budget kind of sword and sorcery films like myself. There's not much there, I don't think. I just don't think it's kind of taps into, you know, what makes these films kind of popular to begin with, or even they're not even that popular these days. Let's be honest. But it kind of just looks like a group of kind of like live action role players have gone out and filmed a bunch of scenes and kind of added some kind of like green screen effects in the background. That is legitimately what it looks like. The story is kind of fairly kind of mundane. It's nothing kind of, you know, particularly kind of interesting or anything like that. I will say, obviously, the filmmakers have got into this project with loads of ambition, wanted to create this kind of fantasy world. But, you know, I think you've got to kind of know your limitations and, you know, make films that you kind of that are going to be made for the budget that you can afford. So I honestly can't recommend this movie outside of it's very ambitious. 3 out of 10. I can't recommend this one at all, I'm sorry to say. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.